to the McLaughlin College Lunchtime Talks. A couple of announcements before we introduce our speaker this afternoon. One for all of the students that are in this room. Please sign the attendance sheet. That makes you eligible to win a prize. We do a draw for a book at the end of each of these McLaughlin College Talks. But if you attend more than 6 or more of these lunchtime talks, you're also entitled to a certificate. So please remember to sign the attendance sheet. 2 other important announcements. There will be Remembrance Day services here on Friday, on the 9th, and we have a special lunchtime talk. The posters have been distributed. It will include Ian Green, a former master here, and Here's to Heroes is the title of that talk. So please join us for that on Friday. And I have to remind everyone in this room as well that we have our annual public policy lecture, which will be on November the 29th, and it'll feature Maria Dion, who is the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner for the Government of Canada. So please join us for that. That will be at 5:30 in the Junior Common Room, followed by a dinner, which will take place at the Schulich Executive Dining Room. So you have to complete the RSVP form that's online, and finally we've got it working properly. So please sign up to attend the dinner if you would like to attend the dinner, but the lecture is open to everyone. Well, today we have a very special guest and speaker, a longtime fellow of this college, who really, I think, looking around the room, probably needs no introduction. He's a wonderful instructor, lecturer. I can attest to that. I'm a former student, so that takes me back a little bit. However, Robert Drummond has also done a number of other things here at this university. I think at one time you held undergraduate program director, as I recall, and then subsequently you were chair, and then went associate dean, and then became the dean of the Faculty of Arts, and is responsible for the current configuration of this faculty as well, because you and Rhonda Linton, I think, came together and formed Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Bob has been a long-time student and indeed an expert on Ontario politics. And we met from time to time over the years. And I know that Bob has been working on a book on Bill Davis. And today he's going to be talking about the Bill Davis years in the province of Ontario, 1971 to 1984. We were hoping that at some point perhaps we could even get Bill Davis here. Unfortunately, that hasn't materialized, but we're all looking forward to your comments. Bob, please join me in welcoming Bob Drummond.
The screen is for a PowerPoint if one had one, but I don't have one, so don't feel. I also want to welcome the handful of students who are here, and also observe that many of the people here are probably old enough to remember Bill Davis, and so I welcome them as well. I should tell you that the Davis government came into office in 1971, which was 1 year after I started teaching at York. And as you know, I'm now retired from York, so you can imagine how long ago this was. 1971, 4 years after the last time the Leafs won the Stanley Cup. And he was in office for 13 years. And what I wanted to talk about today was, in a sense, a sort of comparison of the kind of pragmatic style and civil discourse that characterized that period in contrast to what we see today. Now, I have to say, having been someone who is somewhere on the left end of the political spectrum, I was inclined to be extremely critical of Bill Davis while he was in office. I'm somewhat less critical now, but I do recognize that what his government represented though it was a significant period of reform and change, was a fairly conservative approach to that change and a fairly gradual and pragmatic approach to politics. I want to talk basically about the policy agenda of the government of Bill Davis and the kind of activities, policy activities they engaged in. I don't want to talk much about Bill Davis the man. I think there's a very good biography now by Steve Paikin from TV Ontario. Excellent biography of Bill Davis. It gives you some sense of what he was like as a person. What I want to talk about is what his government was like as a government. This lectern is high enough that the text is close enough for me to see, but it's at an angle that makes it impossible for me to use the bifocals effectively. So if I go astray from the text, you'll understand why. The government, in 13 years in office, undertook some of the most memorable reforms in the province's history. But it did so in some cases reluctantly, and in almost all cases in a gradual and tentative manner that never went so far as its critics demanded. Perhaps it moved as far as its ideology or its supporters and the most powerful social forces in the province would permit. It arguably modernized the executive and legislative branches of government in ways that constrained its own freedom of action. It brought natural justice to the tribunals of agencies and boards, the near courts of the province, to the benefit of the average citizen no less than that of the powerful. It sought to increase the effectiveness of municipal government and of the administration of justice, including a major revision of family law. It furthered the expansion of post-secondary education, and it allowed the social culture of the province to move legally from the 19th to the 20th century, that is in terms of law, from the 19th to the 20th century, in terms of liquor licensing, film classification, the age of majority, and the rights of women. It adjusted slowly and partially to the development of national Medicare, which came into being in the late 60s. Ontario entered into the Medicare scheme in 1968. The preference of the Ontario government prior to it becoming part of national Medicare was that it should put in place a system that could best be described as Obamacare. That is to say, it was private insurance and catastrophic illness insurance and not much attention to single-payer system. When the single-payer system became inevitable, Ontario signed on in 1968 under Robarts government. So by the 1971 period, they were adjusting slowly and partially. They adjusted even more slowly the demands for fair treatment of labor. It said that some of the reforms of the Davis government brought them into line with the 1930s in the United States. But it was a change and an improvement in some case of the legislation in Ontario. And they began to deal with, again, relatively slowly and partially, the burgeoning demands of the environment and the sustainability of energy. In a few of these cases, in very few of these cases, would hindsight permit us to credit them with bold action or more than limited success. However, in many ways, they established the groundwork on which later Liberal NDP governments, I'm thinking now of Peterson, McGuinty, and Wynne Liberal governments, the Bob Rae NDP government, later governments would build, and they set a minimum standard below which later Conservative governments, like Harris and Ford, and Ernie Eves, would be reluctant to fall. Undoubtedly, the most controversial act of this government was one that probably we don't think much of today, and that was a reversal in the last year of their mandate of a promise made by the Premier in the first year in office. In contradiction to what he had said in 1971, Bill Davis extended full provincial funding to high schools in their own Catholic separate school system. Despite all party support for the move, many voters were critical of the decision. At least one Catholic school became wholly private in order to avoid the constraints that they believed would be on their autonomy if they acquired full funding. I would say that now the issue before the province is often whether or not we should retain any separate school system in the province. Newfoundland having done away with theirs, Quebec having done away with theirs. It just seems an anachronism, although a constitutionally grounded anachronism, as many anachronisms are. But it's one of those things interesting. I used to talk education policy in my class on Ontario politics, and we talked about the separate school system, and I'd ask them what their views were on whether we needed to maintain it. And if all the students who had attended the separate school system mostly thought it should be done away with. And those who had not attended it thought it was constitutionally necessary and should be preserved. So, I think it will be an interesting debate if this comes into public once again. You remember that John Tory, when he was the leader of the Ontario Conservative Party, not Mayor of Toronto, pursued as a policy agenda in an election campaign which he lost, the extension of some sort of funding support from the province to other religious groups' schooling. He lost and didn't proceed any further with that. The diverse reaction to the school funding decision represents a kind of microcosm of the task of government in the last decades of the 20th century. Whatever decision government pursued, direction it pursued, was likely to be criticized on both sides. What was defended as pragmatism was often criticized as timidity or ideological reaction. What was defended as necessary modernization was often criticized as abandoning tradition. This may be something in a conservative party progressive conservative party is more likely to occur than others, but there was dispute on both sides of everything they pursued. Their administration's most sustained impact was probably in the reorganization of government, and perhaps in the reforms to the legal system, where pragmatism and caution did not deter significant change. Let me talk a little bit first about reorganization of government. This will be intensely boring to most of you, I'm sure, except James Simeon, who is a student of the area and has written on COGP, and maybe Fred, who puts up with a lot of political science oddity. But in the late 1960s, there was considerable attention being paid in many liberal democracies to the idea that the principles of scientific management could be applied to the executive branch of government. Not sure we still believe that. I sometimes refer to this as science fiction, but it was a sense that things could be done in a better way. And the cabinet and its committees, as well as the public service, could be reorganized to be more efficient. Governments throughout the Western world began to develop organizational tools for policy planning and coordination, probably at least in part because of the growing scope and scale of public sector activity. I'll just pause at this point to say that Doug Sanders has written a recent book on population in Canada, in which he argues that Canada doesn't so much need a larger population it does need a higher density of population. And larger population might not be a bad idea, and one of the things it would allow governments to do would be actually to do some planning and coordination without taking away from the activities of actually providing services in frontline activity. In the 1960s, governments in Canada seemed to believe it was possible to continue providing frontline services, which were growing in scale and scope, but at that time also to put some energy into policy planning and coordination. The post-war scope of public service activity had its initial impetus largely at the national level, because the federal government began to look at areas in which it could spend money to provide public services that had not been provided before. In the immediate post-war period, the sense that we owed something to the generation that had fought the war to improve public service in that area was quite common in Canada as well as in Britain, and to some extent in the United States. The federal government sought to fund many areas that fell, however, within provincial jurisdiction: health, post-secondary education, income support in particular. And they became an important source of funds and general direction through conditional grants in those days. But it was the provinces that had the task of designing and operating programs to address social goals. Prior to Davis coming into office, partly in response to the expansion in provincial government scope, the Robarts government had created a committee on government productivity to conduct research and make recommendations for improvements in executive practice. However, it was left to the Davis government to undertake the implementation of suggested reforms. In the nearly 40 years that followed, a few of the changes they made remained wholly in place. However, the shape of government organization was affected in ways that continue to influence policy and practice in the present day. As a small example, the division of government activity by COGP into three broad policy areas: social development, resources development, and administration of justice, is still used to group legislation, estimates, and accounts in government reports today. And the legislature maintains standing committees in those areas. The Davis government began its term with the implementation of many of the COGP proposals. They had to do with changing the cabinet to have cabinet committees, more widely used. Cabinet, and prior to this, had basically one committee, Treasury Board, that then expanded the number of committees and allowed for they thought, more efficient planning of government policy. It made some changes in the structure of the public service. They had to deal with the question of computerization. This was the beginnings of the introduction of, what do they call it? Data processing, I think, and it was electronic data processing, which came to be computing. And it was in those days, where would the mainframes be located? What kind of data would they have to use? But they embarked on some computerization in there long before we all had carried a computer in our pockets with more power than the mainframes that they had on their office floors. The Davis government began its term with the implementation of these CRGP proposals, as I said, but soon after taking office, it turned its attention to the modernization of the legislative branch as well. Now, prior to Davis coming into office, the legislature of Ontario met relatively infrequently for a short period of time, that is maybe twice during the year for short periods. They had very large committees that actually operated almost like a microcosm of the Legislative Assembly. The opposition was significantly constrained in how it can call the government to account. And it really was not a very modern operation. In 1972, the Davis government established a Royal Commission under the leadership of Dalton Camp, charged with making recommendations to improve the effectiveness of the Legislative Assembly. And over the next few years, many of the Commission's recommendations were implemented after a review by a special committee of the Assembly. When the committee was struck, or when the Royal Commission was struck, it was referred to as the Pay Committee, because one of the main recommendations was that it was going to increase the salaries of legislative members. But it had other things to do as well. It produced the first question period in the Ontario legislature. Prior to that, the legislature would allow for a couple of written questions to be presented each day, and the ministers would respond to them later. But the Camp Commission recommended the establishment of a question period, such as was in use federally. And now there's a regular question period in the Legislative Assembly. Television introduction into the Legislative Assembly came as a result of the Camp Commission's recommendation. Following the lead of other jurisdictions, notably Nova Scotia and the federal government, the Davis government proposed the first legislation to regulate election finance in Ontario. In addition, it created the office of the Ombudsman, reporting to the legislature, and significantly amended the Ontario Constitution. So it was bringing a lot of material that we now expect to be a normal part of government activity, government organization, into place for the first time. In addition to several changes in the administration of courts in the province, the Davis government established procedures for administrative tribunals to ensure the application there of the basic principles of natural justice. Nobody is judging their own case, both sides should be heard, things in that order. The reforms in this area were mainly in response to the report of another Royal Commission, the McClure Royal Commission of Inquiry into Civil Rights, which was established in 1964, reported in 68, so all within the Robarts period. They could legitimately be described as long overdue reforms. Natural justice, after all, shouldn't be something you have to try to organize in the mid-20th century. It should have been there from the outset. But it did significantly modernize the operation of the so-called near courts. These are not real courts, they're tribunals that have court-like powers. All of these changes in government organization were undertaken in a gradual and conservative manner, yet taken together, they constitute perhaps the most far-reaching program of organization and procedural reform in the province's history up to that time. The Davis government's organizational reforms were not restricted to Queen's Park, however, or its ministries. In a period of major urban growth, the government was forced to address numerous issues of municipal government and public service, municipal public service. Housing, rent review, property tax assessment, public transit, social welfare, all received particular attention. Particularly rent review during the period of minority government. The Davis government had a majority from 1971 to 1975, was in minority in two periods from 75 to 77 and 77 to 81, two different opposition parties. And then in 81 came back to majority status. But in the period of minority government, a lot of changes were made that probably might have been more slowly made, if at all, had the government retained a majority. And one of the things they did put in place at that time was rent review. Now, rent review, somewhat controversial topic, because at the time it was introduced, it was thought to be a very good idea because there was a considerable dearth of rental accommodation, and therefore it was thought that the landlords were gouging their tenants and should be constrained in how much they can increase rents. Since then, I think a lot of people have paid attention to the possibility that having rent review makes it less likely that you will create rental accommodation, and so the lack of rental accommodation remains a continuing problem in the province, but at the time, it seemed like a progressive thing to do to bring in rent review. The main change, however, that they made was to undertake the implementation of regional governments in the province. Main municipal government change they made. This is analogous to the two-tier experiment that had been undertaken by the Frost government in the 1950s to create the Metropolitan Toronto. Some of you, well, most of you will remember when it was Metropolitan Toronto with 2 tiers of government, a Metropolitan Council and then several municipal councils. Some of you may be old enough to remember when there were 13 municipal councils in part of Metro. Before the amalgamation into the city of Toronto, running from Steeles to the waterfront, Metropolitan Toronto was a 2-tier system. At the time, it seemed like a very good way to organize municipal government. It would allow for the uploading from town and township councils of things that they were ill-equipped to deal with because of their small size, and allowed for a regional government to take over those areas and effectively coordinate and manage certain local government functions in suburban and exurban areas of the province, which are now growing extensively. Until the amalgamation project of the Harris government in the 1990s, this program was the most major change in municipal organization since the creation of two-tier government by the Frost government in the 1950s in Toronto. So they created the regional governments. You still have the regional government in Peel region and York region and Durham region around us, but a lot of regional governments that were created at this time period have since been done away with by amalgamation, much as Metro Toronto was done away with by amalgamation under the Harris government. Like his predecessor, John Robarts, William Davis had come into the premiership from the education portfolio. He had been Minister of Education. And in that role, he had overseen the implementation of wholesale changes in elementary and secondary education, derived from a Royal Commission report, the Hall-Dennis Commission, which reported in 1960, it was created in 1965, reported in 1968, and it was a commission that recommended a considerable revision of the structure and organization of elementary and secondary schools, to put the focus of attention on the student as learner rather than the teacher, and the it was going to be student-centered learning, and it allowed for much more open classrooms and wholesale restructuring of a classroom environment, which when I was a boy had students sitting in small, fixed rows of desks, some of them actually sometimes bolted to the floor, and a teacher droning on from the front with no particularly collaborative activities going on in the group. The Hall-Dennis report was received as controversial, and so during the time that the reforms were being implemented, and many of them were implemented during the early years of the Davis government, there was considerable reaction from those who preferred the old system or felt that the new system was not sufficiently attuned to the realities of the classroom. It was in effect pie in the sky, and so they undertook a considerable number of reforms as a result of the Hall-Dennis Commission, but many of them were then pulled back gradually over time, as sometimes teachers didn't fully implement them, sometimes school boards didn't require it, and in some instances the government simply said, no, we've gone too far, we're going to change the rules. However, he undertook the separation, the Davis government undertook the separation of colleges and universities from education, and their installation under the authority of a new separate ministry. Because the colleges and universities were expanding in this period. The number of colleges and universities were expanding in the province. This was the time for the creation of, this is just after the creation of York, Trent, the transformation of Windsor and Wilfrid Laurier from being Assumption College and Wilfrid Laurier and Waterloo Lutheran into the secular university they are today, and building a number of other institutions in the province. And this then allowed for the Davis government to say, this is now an area which needs its own ministry. He had also been responsible as Minister of Education for the beginnings of the colleges of applied arts and technology. And so having this now vast expansion in post-secondary education meant giving it to a separate ministry. I tell you that this is partly as a reflection of the post-war baby boom. I used to say, I was born in 1945. Post-war baby boom began in 1946, lasted until about 1964. I never went to a school that wasn't under construction, because every time coming behind me was this vast horde of new babies coming into the school system. So the expansion of post-secondary education in the 1970s, probably not, late 1960s or 1970s, probably a sensible approach to a growing body of demand just on demographic basis alone. Never mind that there was also an expectation that post-secondary education would become a more normal form of education, a more required form of education in the future. The growth and importance of schools in the post-war baby boom generation it enhanced the power and militancy of teachers. And issues of teacher wages and working conditions were a necessary concern of the Davis government throughout its term. The right of teachers to strike was a matter of contention in the early Davis years, and in 1975, just before the provincial election, and following 2 years of teacher militancy and wildcat strike walkouts, teachers were given the right to strike. Subsequent years saw several such job actions, in many cases ending by legislation sending the disputes to arbitration. In all likelihood, the government would have preferred a system, in fact they said they would have preferred a system that substituted compulsory arbitration for the right to strike. Though the school boards and the province might have become concerned if they bore additional costs if arbitrators had regularly been more sympathetic to teachers' unions than to their employers, which often happens in wage disputes. The 1970s saw growth in our consciousness of environmental fragility. The focus of attention for naturalists in the 1950s and 60s had been conservation. They were interested in preserving resources which they would then depend on for economic use, primarily wilderness and forest resources, wilderness for tourism, forest resources for logging. By the early 1970s, the interconnections of natural processes had made ecology a widely used term, and the impact of industrial and other activities on air and water quality was regularly in the news. The disposal of toxic waste, the impact of fossil fuel burning on acid precipitation, and the threats, this is before we knew about the ozone layer, we knew about greenhouse gases, this was simply acid rain. And the threats to health from PCB and mercury contamination in the water system, all of these were things that came to the government's and the media's radar during the early years of the Davis government. In recognition of the impact that large-scale development projects would have on a fragile ecosystem, the government produced the first Environmental Assessment Act requiring pre-approval of development projects on environmental grounds. While all of the actions taken were criticized by environmental activists as inadequate, they did provide a first step in a grounding for later more aggressive environmental legislation under the Liberal NDP Accord between Peterson Gray and the Ministers. Similar to the area of labor relations, Crown employee collective bargaining, teachers' right to strike, equal pay for substantially similar work, occupational health and safety, labor rights in the construction industry, Workmen's Compensation Board, as it then was known. It was known as the Workmen's Compensation before it became the Workers' Compensation Board, before it became the Workplace Health and Safety Insurance Board. The government was active, but with very limited goals. They showed considerable reluctance to shift the purported, quote, balance, unquote, of employer and employee rights in the workplace. I'm reminded of the French scholar politician who said that the law in its infinite wisdom denied to rich and poor alike the right to sleep under bridges and beg in the streets. So the balance in labor relations was often between a very powerful employer and a somewhat less powerful set of unions. However, the government did take an action that was fairly bold in this field. They included in the Occupational Health and Safety Act the right to refuse unsafe work. However, the same law asserted joint responsibility of labor and management for safety in the workplace, despite the undoubtedly greater capacity of management to determine conditions in the factory or job site. While the government took measures to ease a trade union's task of being recognized as a bargaining agent for a group of employees, they did not go as far as the NDP government of Bob Rae in that regard, or in establishing a first contract when the union was certified. They supported equal pay for men and women. They didn't go so far as the Liberal government of David Peterson and established equal pay for work of equal value. It remains a question whether the Davis government took a progressive approach as far as they believed was proper or possible, or if they maintained a conservative stance with little movement because of their reliance on the financial and other support of powerful employers. How am I doing for time? Speed it up or leave things out? In an era of complex federal-provincial relations, this was, remember, 1 year after the Quebec crisis, in which the separatist groups had kidnapped James Cross and cabinet minister's name I keep forgetting. Quebec cabinet minister who they murdered. So federal provincial relations, particularly involving Quebec, were an issue. The Ontario government acted first as a supporter of constitutional patriation. Davis was involved very actively in the early 1980s when the Canadian Constitution was brought back from the United Kingdom and a new constitution established. And second, as an intended example of how well francophones could live in Canada outside Quebec. In the latter regard, the Davis government acted to expand French language services, quote, where numbers warrant, unquote, and to extend the availability of French language education, again, where numbers warranted, where numbers of students made it possible. They consistently resisted efforts to declare the province a bilingual province. Partly, I suspect, because they recognized that if they did so, they would face, with an increasingly diverse, ethnically diverse community, a lot of demands from other groups to say, well, if the French, who are maybe 70,000 people in Toronto and a few 100,000 otherwise scattered throughout Cornwall and Ottawa and those areas, if they can demand their own language, what about the large groups of Italian immigrants in Toronto or Finnish immigrants in northern Canada, northern Ontario, and so on? So without deciding that they could become a bilingual province, they did agree that French language services could be provided where numbers warranted, including putting French language interpreters into the court system. Finally, while the Davis government was pursuing the above agenda of reform, it was also addressing a wide range of lesser complexity but similar public importance. Highway safety, including mandatory seatbelt use, came in under the Davis government. The right to serve beer in the new Major League Baseball stadium. The Jays came to Toronto in 1977. There was the Davis government being asked, can you serve beer in a ballpark? Beer in a bar park in the U.S., almost everywhere, I presume everywhere. I don't think there's any teetotal ball stadiums in the U.S. So finally they agreed, yes, despite the fact that Ontario still had fairly strict, not to say antiquated liquor laws, they did say that you could serve beer in a baseball stadium. Civilian review of police was put into place more effectively here. Auto insurance rules were improved, although they didn't go so far as the NDP government promised to do and then did not do, which was to bring about public auto insurance. They improved children's aid services, public support for daycare and regulation thereof. In the early 1970s, they responded to an upswing in economic nationalism by establishing an investigation of foreign investment in the province. But then they didn't do anything. And once they had done the investigation, nothing changed. That issue faded later in the decade as they were faced with a significant budgetary challenge, which was basically the combination, which was not expected ever to be able to occur, of low economic growth and high inflation, so-called stagflation, stagnation and inflation, was something that was not really supposed to be possible. There it was. Prices were going up considerably rapidly and unemployment was also high. The issue, they collaborated with the federal government on the implementation of wage and price controls, mostly wage controls, as well as seeking to control provincial expenditures to moderate inflation. When economic matters improved, they pursued an agenda of economic development through public support for business ventures, and they addressed consumer protection, especially in the travel industry and among trust companies, in response to particular scandals. In the earliest years, the Legislative Assembly passed a large number of acts with very limited and specific purpose. In the second and third sessions, 1972 and 73 of the 29th Parliament, there were 174 and 177 public acts passed, respectively. It would be a generous assessment to identify 30 of them as being of major importance. In later years, perhaps because of changes in both the executive and legislative branches, fewer acts were passed, but a similar number, and therefore a higher proportion, could be described as important. So what's the upshot of all of this? Did I just tell you all this to bore you to tears? No. What is clear is that 13 years the Davis government faced enormous changes in the economy and society of Ontario. Population grew, significantly. After 1967, Canada began to widen the range and diversity of the sources of immigrants to the country. Many immigrants came then, as they do now, to the city of Toronto as their preferred location. There was a major change, therefore, in the cultural makeup of the city. By the 1970s, one had to take account of that to some extent in changes in legislation. It was no longer Belfast West, as my parents used to refer to it. Toronto was so rigidly Presbyterian that it could not keep up with the changing circumstances of an ethnically diverse community. No longer the case. It was unquestionably active in pursuing responses to the changes in Davis government laws. Could be described as unexpectedly progressive and forward-looking. It's a conservative government, after all. Progressive conservative, but conservative government. However, they were cautious to the point of paralysis in some areas of public importance. And the question is how much of what it accomplished was made possible by a more pragmatic, less confrontational style of politics, and how much of what it failed to achieve was made impossible by a blinkered commitment to tradition and powerful reactionary interests. What remains of the legacy of the Davis government and politics of the present, and how much has been overwhelmed by ideological rigidities of left and right, or by a more crudely confrontational partisan discourse, remains to be seen. So I think I've rambled on long enough. Are there any questions? Rude comments? Yes.
Bob, during the 1970s, political governments of all parties, liberal, conservative, NDP, started to run big deficits.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very popular because, you spend money and you get services. And I recall reading that the CCF finance minister Saskatchewan, I guess in the 50s, says, we don't run a deficit because that makes bankers rich and then it makes it difficult to expand social programs. Given that Davis started that, wouldn't that be a bit of a shortcoming for this government?
Well, Davis wasn't the first Ontario government to run deficits.
But they expanded the market.
They did expand them markedly. They did so in what I would suggest was a kind of Keynesian response. That is to say, they were facing what they saw clearly as stagnation of economic growth. They didn't know how to deal with the inflation side of that. And one way of dealing with stagnation is to try to stimulate aggregate demand by government expenditure and running deficits to do so, in other words, borrowing money to do so. When I used to lecture on fiscal policy to my Ontario government course, I would tell them that government debt was a means by which you transferred resources from taxpayers to bondholders. Of course, now that I'm on a pension, I'm concerned with the rights of bondholders, but it is a wealth transfer in a way that, as you said, limits the capacity of the government to do other things than I was to do. In part, it reflected, I think, the period, the post-war, immediate post-war period, in which governments had decided that they managed to build up enormous debt during the war, because you could defend having a debt during the war because you were fighting a war. And so they recognized that coming into the peace, they would probably have to reduce the dependence on borrowing. At the same time, they recognized, or they believed, that it was necessary to begin public expenditure in areas that had been suspended from public expenditure or never contemplated for public expenditure prior to the war. And they were wanting to avoid the Great Depression, the problems of the Great Depression, and they wanted to provide something that was a reward for the generation that had fought the war, in a sense. They lived through the Depression and the war, and now they wanted a better society, and that was going to require provision, in the judgment of many governments, provision of public goods. It has meant that since that time, we have accumulated a considerable public debt in the province of Ontario, particularly. How big an issue is it? If you're the Ontario Conservative Party at the moment, you are, and this has been a Conservative Party position regardless of what they've actually done in office. Their position has always been deficits and debt's a bad idea. It's seen as, regularly described by friends and colleagues of mine as the largest sovereign debt in any jurisdiction in North America. Okay, what is it as a proportion of the gross domestic product of the province? That's been relatively stable. We have increased times of downward economic circumstances, but what all governments seem to have forgotten in the Keynesian model is once the stimulus has been successful and the economy's come back into balance, you should be able to balance the budget. In fact, you should run a surplus. They don't do that for the most part. So they decide on debt and deficit in part on the basis of political rather than economic factors. So the government of Ontario carefully brought itself to balance just before the last provincial election and then announced that it was going to introduce a new deficit budget in order to spend a lot of money on things they thought might get them reelected. Didn't work. This government now is saying that it's going to try to constrain the deficit, reduce it. Not clear how they're going to do it, since they've also said they want to lower taxes and they're going to cut some services. Sorry, that's a long rambling answer. But in general, yes, you can blame governments in this period for somewhat for extending the degree of dependence on public debt. The whole organization of the provincial budget changes in this period as well. Prior actually changes in the period, the late Frost, early Robarts government, which moved from the way in which they accounted for public expenditures that were kind of investments in infrastructure, and which they kept as a separate capital budget for a very long time. Now it's much more integrated into the total budget, and so you see what you could reasonably describe as, you know, taking out a mortgage on the house, and you're borrowing money to pay for things that you will use for a generation. But we're also spending increasingly on things, and they're not clearly separated in the budget, spending on things where we're actually just using up the money in the current time. So, sorry, I'm too long an answer. Anybody got a shorter question? Yes?
Well, on a political note, I guess, I was active in politics pretty much from birth, I think, and the reputation of the Ontario Liberal Party through the Robarts years and the first half of the Davis years was as a much more conservative and much more reactionary group than the Robarts gang or the Bill Davis gang, at least until we got into minority territory and they changed leadership and their demographics changed somewhat from where they actually elected people after some years of kind of a small rump in the Southwest. Could you sort of describe your thoughts on how, what kind of an ebb and flow there was in the Davis government in response to the political demands or the political perceived threat from the opposition parties?
Well, the principal focus of attention of the Conservative government, I think, from 1943 to 1984, was to make sure that neither opposition party managed to destroy the other. In other words, if you had two similarly strong but both relatively weak opposition parties, you could guarantee that you would form a government because they would split the opposition vote, which they did routinely for all of that time period. And in some respects, I guess the Liberals were seen as a relatively socially conservative organization for many years because they were grounded, as you said, in southwestern rural Ontario. I think of Mitch Hepburn as the example of someone who, Mitch Hepburn was premier of the province in the 1930s, but came into office as a kind of populist. He was going to be for the little guy, the man on the back concessions, and wound up hobnobbing with the industrialists in Toronto and really running a very small C conservative kind of administration. In fact, he feuded regularly with Mackenzie King, the Liberal leader. He was a Liberal premier of Ontario, feuded with the Liberal prime minister in Ottawa because Mackenzie King was, however conservative you might think him, was more progressive than Hepburn. Anyway, I think that the Liberals had that kind of reputation to some extent because of social conservatism rather more than economic conservatism. By the time the 1970s came along, their leader was a psychiatrist from Montreal, Stuart Smith. And so they moved a little bit away from the social conservatism of that era. But they were still facing an NDP party that was the successor of the CCF that was strong in certain parts of the province, in the northern areas, where the NDP is strong today. It's in urban areas and in the north. And so they were never able to kind of overcome that. Now, during the period of the minority government, 1975, the NDP actually became the official opposition, much as it is today, although the Liberals were close on their heels. In other words, there was not much between them. So they agreed that they would not force a confidence vote for 2 years. And the Conservatives governed for 2 years, and then did something he knew would force a confidence vote, which they did, and they were defeated. There was an election, and another minority government. But this time the Liberals were the official opposition. And again, the NDP was very close to them. And so that went on really through 1981 election, 1984. Davis left office and was replaced by Frank Miller. In 1985, they go to the polls, and strangely enough, the two opposition parties were still pretty close to one another, but they now exceeded the Conservatives. So Miller's Conservatives had a minority, and when they met the House, there was a possibility that either the Liberals or the NDP would combine with Miller to sustain a Conservative government, but it's a pretty slim possibility. The real greater likelihood of what actually occurred was the Liberals and the NDP formed an accord. Not a coalition government, the NDP got no ministries out of this. It was kind of a bad deal from their perspective because they got simply to suggest certain policy proposals, which they thought that both parties could agree upon. The Liberals passed them, and then the Liberals called an election in 1987, I guess, and won most of the seats in the legislature. The NDP were almost wiped out. So not a good bargain from the point of view of Bob Rae. However, 3 years later, the Liberals foolishly called an election before it was time, probably not recognizing there might be a recession coming, which there was, and the NDP formed a government. So why am I rambling through all this history? Because I think the failure of the Conservatives to maintain that balance between the two opposition parties meant that they could be defeated in the House. Now, the Liberals come into office and the NDP comes into office, and in both cases, the Conservatives remained relatively weak. And so the Liberals were able to govern between 1985 and 1990, the NDP 1995, with relatively little concern with the growing strength of the Conservative opposition. So that by the time Harris came for his second election in 1995, he had built up a kind of war chest comparable to what the so-called Big Blue machine had before, and was able to run a campaign that had a kind of element of what we might call populism about it. Common sense revolution. If you believe common sense is better than knowledge, or what might be called real knowledge, then that's a kind of populist appeal. Ordinary people know more than the experts. Common sense. And here are three simple issues. Vote for me and we'll do something about it. Which they did. People voted for them. My worst complaint about the Harris government is they did exactly what they said they were going to do. If they had lied, I would have preferred it. And then they were when Ernie Eves replaced Harris, they eventually won another election in 1999 and then lost in 2003. And we had Liberal government for a while. Somebody asked me, again, I talked the other day on Ontario after the election to a retired men's group. This is kind of retired in a women's group, I think. One or two students, thank you for coming. Somebody asked the question, well, was the Liberal government defeated because people were tired of 15 years of Liberal government? I said, well, they didn't defeat the Conservatives until they'd had 43 years there, or 41 years. So, how did I get off on that tangent? I don't know. Anyway, that's more than you want to know about the composition of the parties. Yes.
Could you, looking back, as I would say some of us looked through, the style of political rhetoric and discourse during that period seems infinitely superior to what's going on today. And is that a romantic vision of the past, or would you say that that's accurate? And if so, why?
Somewhat romantic, but pretty accurate, actually, because I think at the time I would have said, no, the discourse is pretty critical. Everybody's very critical of the government they're not in. The opposition was very critical. Stephen Lewis was leading the NDP at the time, part of this time period. Donald MacDonald first, then Stephen Lewis, and then Michael Cassidy. And the Liberals were led by Stuart Smith and eventually Donald McGuinty. They were all very critical of the government and demeaned them for their unreasonable conservatism. But it was delivered with a tone of a degree of civility. I mean, even if you were highly critical, you could work together in the legislature. When you got a majority government, you almost don't need to work with the opposition. And there were two periods of minority government here where there had to be some degree of collaboration, cooperation, and they managed it. The discourse now, in the US particularly, but increasingly maybe here as well, is becoming rather harsher. I don't think we're quite at the level of Donald Trump here yet. I mean, Doug Ford is not Donald Trump. He says things that are sometimes a little outrageous, but a little outrageous is not, lying every day 10 times a day. It's not demeaning your opponents with, and whether in government or not, with wholly dismissive and racist epithets. I mean, you don't get that from Doug Ford, much as I might not like him or not like his government. There still remains a degree of civility in the discourse. Now, are we going to see it change at the federal level? Andrew Scheer has been very critical of the Trudeau government, and yet it's still, apart from, you might think, if you're a liberal, you probably think some of his comments are outrageous, but they're not uncivil on the whole. There's some mockery, but there's no outright dismissal. So, you know, I'm not naive enough to think that Canada is immune to this kind of thing. We can develop it, there's no question. But so far, I don't think we have. But it was at the time in the Davis government, I think, a somewhat more formal and congenial, not to say cooperation necessarily, but at least recognition that your opponent's not necessarily his enemy. Yeah.
So I actually lived a life. I was seconded to the Duke of Kent, and I worked for the gentleman who's in the beginning of this book became president of this university. And those were the halcyon years. Those are the golden years. And you're speaking with like an nostalgia, which I find interesting. But you asked for like an evaluation. So I'm not going to give an evaluation out of my own. But earlier this week, there was a premier that came to U of T. And he talked to the students about public policy, just like this is a public policy discussion. And it was Gordon Campbell. And he said that what you should try and do is not what you're talking about here, where Davis was on a pragmatic course, where there was no dogma, but that they reacted, you know, to the exigencies of the time, whether it was universities or they were responsive because they had people. So what Campbell said to these students is, imagine something that you don't want to happen, because he said it will happen. And that was addressed to people in public policy.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in a different era now. We're in a different era of climate change. We're not responding, we're responding to crises which are like hard to imagine. Healthcare is one that Campbell talked about.
Yeah, it's true. As I say, I gave this talk about what the Ontario government is facing currently. There are several things that are wicked problems. I mean, the opioid crisis, climate change, housing issues. I mean, Campbell came out of a province where the housing market in its capital city is probably worse than it is in Toronto, but bad enough in Toronto, and homelessness. All issues that I think there's still an expectation among most Canadians that government has a role to play in dealing with it. But they're wicked problems, difficult to find the resolution. Now, you said, in a sense, what you're implying from Campbell's comments, I think, is public policy has to be, and has to anticipate that they will face things that they didn't think they were going to have to face, and hope never to have to face. That's probably true. You don't throw up your hands in horror and go away. And maybe if what you're saying is the Davis government came into office during a period of significant change in the province of Ontario, and all they did was react to it. Probably true. But did they react to it relatively successfully, or at least set the groundwork for what could be relatively successful reactions to what seemed to be solvable problems at the time? Cultural differentiation in society, changes in family structure, more dependence on family law for families that were increasingly fragile, ecological change that did not yet seem to be an existential threat to the planet, but did seem to be a problem for the society. They reacted to those in ways that suggested that there might be solutions to be found, and they were trying to find them. I'm not sure that's bad public policy. I'm not saying that's what you were saying, but it seemed to be almost what the best you can hope for. Carl?
Just a bit ago, you were responding to the questions of civility over a period of time, and you referred to Donald Trump, and as you went on to explain, but he's, excuse me, you referred to Doug Ford and said, but he's not Donald Trump, and
Not
went
yet.
on for a bit. And I sat there thinking, no, he isn't, but he's taking a wrecking ball with using the charter to knock out institutions, which ultimately may be a faster destruction than even the United States goes through for the rules of law, rules that we live by. So civility shouldn't
be comfortable about relative civility.
you
No,
know,
you're right.
we should be very grateful for it, but also not
Not
give it
comfortable.
more in this.
No, I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that is true of parliamentary governments, not true of congressional government in the United States, is you get a majority government, you're a dictator for 4 years. You can do what you like. You've got a majority. Now, Trump thought he could do as he liked because he had both houses of Congress and pretty much the Supreme Court. Now he only has one house of Congress and the Supreme Court. Will it change things? Maybe. But in terms of what Doug Ford is embarking on as an agenda, a policy agenda, yeah. I think there is significant change being contemplated, particular and undertaken in areas that, in some cases, people didn't vote for. In other cases, they may have voted for. Certainly, the slogan that he was for the common, not the common man, what does he call it? For the people. He's for the people. Well, he's not for people if they're organized in labor unions. He's not for the people if they're on minimum wage. He's not for the people if they happen to be homeless. I mean, it's a kind of a, it's what I think is true almost of all populist leaders. You start off with an appeal to the people on the basis that ordinary folks are the backbone of the country and they know what's best, and then you do things for the elites that you've been disparaging all through the campaign. So, yeah, I'm not assuming that we're in great shape because Doug Ford is somewhat less confrontational in his discourse than Donald Trump. Definitely not. Any other questions? James?
Well, I have a question. I'm just wondering, when you look at the Bill Davis years, it's interesting that it sort of mirrors the period of time that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was in office as well. And there seemed to be some sort of, I don't know, kind of symmetry between the policies that were coming out at the federal level and what Bill Davis was doing at the provincial level, and there seemed to be some sort of complementarity that was going on between the two of them. Great supporters, as you mentioned, of the repatriation of the Constitution. I know that Trudeau was very disappointed that Ontario did not become officially bilingual, but
he was presumably equally disappointed that Quebec didn't become officially bilingual either.
yeah, indeed. And then, of course, the National Energy Program and the establishment of Petro-Canada, the purchase of Suncor.
Yeah,
So I'm just wondering, have you looked at that relationship between Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his style of leadership, which was obviously very different, charismatic and so on, versus Bill Davis, who would like to conceive or think of themselves as the linchpin of Confederation, etc.?
No, I think that's an interesting point. I have looked a little bit at it, not much, because I was focusing primarily on Ontario. But yes, you need to see Ontario in the federal context. And as I said, it was just after the Quebec crisis, the Q crisis, you know, it was, and then leading into the repatriation of the Constitution. There were constitutional conferences and conventions under the Robarts government as well. We didn't get the repatriation by then. In terms of personal style, yeah, clearly the style was very different. Trudeau tried to be charismatic, I think, and has tried to be provocative. Just watch me. I mean, I think he was someone who believed that, with some justification, that he was smarter than the average person in the room. Whereas Davis behaves very humbly, personally, the leader of a very large province, very effective government, and yet he personally was extremely quiet and humble. And yet he worked hand in glove with Trudeau on the Constitution, and with others, other premiers. And some of the policies are similar. I mean, they're not the same, but they rhyme. I mean, but it may reflect the fact that they were both facing similar social changes. I mean, I think the decision of the federal government in the post-war period to embark on massive investment in healthcare, education, post-secondary education, and income support were decisions that the provincial government, that the federal government continued pursuing under Trudeau favorably to that, and changes in the criminal code and changes in social, the law around social action taking place at the federal level. And in the province, you've got to administer the conditional grants and put in place the programs to get that money. And so, and you're facing the same sort of social challenges, same sort of social changes. And maybe that's almost inevitable, that they would be similar. I'm not sure they ever voted for one another, but that's you mentioned, I'm sorry, I have to come back. You mentioned Gordon Campbell, who is in the province in part because the current government has asked him to investigate the finances of the province and to kind of produce a report. Now, he had been Premier of British Columbia, of course, and British Columbia, Fred will correct me on this, has routinely had a much more combative discourse in its politics. Not quite Australia, but it is more combative than Ontario's been. I'm not sure Gordon Campbell fits that mold as well as
Dave Barrett.
Van der Zalm or even Barrett, yeah. But it is a different order of things. Now, he's coming in to look at the finance of the province, presumably with rather more small c conservative, say, BC Liberal approach to expenditure than the current government, or that the previous Liberal government. So it's odd. I mean, you could say, here's progressive conservative premier inviting a Liberal to come in and look at the finances. Well, he's not a Liberal in the Ontario Liberal sense. Yeah.
Well, speaking of finances, my recollection is that the Davis government wasn't afraid to raise taxes, whereas ever since Mike Harris, it's been it's spooked everybody.
Yeah,
is that true?
They did raise taxes, but not a lot. And I think they would routinely, in the budget statements each year, say that they were maintaining a prudent policy with respect to taxes. I have it written down. I don't have it written with me. I'm writing its potential chapter. James says I'm working on a book. I've been working on this so long. It's no longer working on a book. It's the book I'm not working on. But I was working on a chapter on finances, and one of the things was their statements in their budget about how they were investing money. They were trying to encourage private sector investment, because private sector investment, they said, is the engine of growth in the economy. You can't rely on government to do that. You've got to encourage the private sector. And one of the ways of doing that was to not maintain high tax rates, and corporate taxes particularly. So they do raise taxes during the period of stagflation particularly, but not enormously, and probably not as much as, well, I'd be interested. I have to look and see whether the Liberal government followed them, raised them more or not. And certainly the Ray government faced economic challenges.
You mentioned CGOP.
CGOP, yeah.
That was interesting. I mean, part of the success of the Davis government was having extremely strong and competent ministers. And we're talking about Alan Lawrence,
Yeah.
Murtry,
Yes.
we're talking about Bill Stewart in agriculture.
Yeah.
And Davis only won that leadership by 45 votes
Yeah.
when the Duke of Kent walked across the floor and gave him the golden handshake. So
Yeah.
those people ran fiefdoms. Just on the question of taxes, they did abolish the state taxes.
They did. That is true. Yes. Which one could think of as a modernization rather than a tax move, but they did. Yeah, I think there's something in that. McMurtry oversaw a major restructuring of the court system, which was a significant undertaking. Darcy McHugh was certainly very active as finance and then Treasury Economics and Intergovernmental Affairs, strong minister, no question. And yeah, Davis won his leadership over strong ministers. Interestingly, COGP, one of the reforms that it proposed was that the government should create special ministries whose function would be planning the future and coordination, so-called provincial secretaries. And then they said you should create a super ministry, which is a kind of a central agency for Treasury, Economic, and Intergovernmental Affairs. And who did Davis put at the head of each of those ministries? People he defeated for the leadership.
Right.
Well, TIGA, because it's finance, was inevitably going to be important. But the others, because they provided no line services, they were only planning ministries, were not seen as super ministries, they were seen as sub-ministries. This is one of the failures of COGP in a sense. If you thought that you were going to create powerful coordinating ministries, in fact you created sort of, lame duck's not quite the right expression, but they were not ministers who had very much visibility because they were not producing a particular public good or servicing the public directly. And so when it came time to ask questions in the legislature, you're going to ask questions of the ministers who are actually doing things with the public. If you ask the minister, provincial secretary, a question, it would likely be about future policy. Well, you can't ask a question about future policy because the government's response is, that's future policy, we haven't decided, that's before cabinet. You can't ask that question. So they didn't get a lot of action in the House, and very soon they began to fall away from those positions. They just resigned. Robert Welch stayed on as Attorney General, but Justice Minister, but the others disappeared. And of course, McHugh had a more powerful ministry, so it didn't bother him. We have about 15 minutes before I have to actually leave, so if James wants to call an end to all of this, that'd be...
Last call for any questions.
Yeah, that'd be
Seeing none.
good.
Thank you so much.